Welkom bij weer een nieuwe aflevering van Een Goed Gesprek. Ik heb vandaag een bijzondere gast, niemand minder dan John Laughland. Welkom John.
Thank you, hello.
John spreekt Engels, dus zometeen voor het gesprek ga ik over naar het Engels. Maar ik zal hem nog eerst even kort aankondigen in het Nederlands. John is eigenlijk de directeur van FVD International, de internationale tak van Forum voor Democratie. En daarnaast geeft hij ook les aan een universiteit in Parijs. En vandaag gaan wij het eigenlijk vooral hebben over zijn expertise. En dat is eigenlijk de verhoudingen tussen het oosten en het westen. En ook, we gaan ook even kort induiken op de oorlog tussen Rusland en Oekraïne. En met name eigenlijk de mediaperspectieven over dat conflict. Well, welcome, John. Again.
Thank you very much, Bart. It's very kind of you to invite me.
We're pleased to have you here. And it's really interesting to have a talk with you because in the media, or at least in Dutch media, they talk a lot about you, but never with you. So we were like, well, we want to talk with you.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
As I already said in Dutch, today the main topic will be the media narrative about the conflict between like the West and East.
Yes.
I think it's better to say it like that than like Russia, Ukraine, because in the end, I feel that Ukraine is more nowadays like an outpost for the West. And
well, it's trying to be, yes, geopolitically, yeah.
So, like, my first question is, you repeatedly argued that Western media highly present like a one-sided view of the conflict. What is that one-sided view in your opinion?
I would put it much more strongly than that. I would say that there are parallel universes, and this has been the case now since the Maidan coup in 2014. At the time of the events of 2014, I remember remarking on that already, that there were two parallel narratives, one on the Russian side and one on the Western side, and these narratives were completely different. They were literally parallel universes, and I was very struck at that time already, so going back whatever that is now, more than 10 years, I was already struck by how there was absolutely no transmission between these two parallel universes, even to the extent of images not being transmitted. So, of course, images can be transmitted, as we know, in a second by internet or phone or whatever. But images which have had a great power in terms of propaganda on both sides just didn't cross the boundary. Yeah. They didn't go from one universe to another, that situation has not changed. It's only got worse, obviously, since the full-scale invasion, as they call it, started in 2022.
Yeah. Do you also feel that we these days are in like a rewind of the Cold War mentality?
Yes, but I think, let me go straight to the point, or what I think is the most important point, because I'm very happy to talk about Russia, but in a way I don't think it is the point. I think that the mainstream media perception that you referred to is part of an ideological war against European conservatives. Russia is just the pretext. Russia is the pretext, the instrument, the cudgel. It's not the real issue. I mean, of course, it's a very important issue. It's absolutely crucial for European politics. Russia is the biggest country in Europe, so it's an extremely important issue. But you mentioned in your introduction the mainstream media, and I believe that our highly and increasingly ideological governments, both at national and European level, devote more and more effort, almost I would say exclusive effort, to controlling the narrative, controlling all narratives. So obviously on climate, on COVID, on Russia, Ukraine, on Europe, on nationhood, on immigration, on race, on all kinds of issues. We're all aware, or certainly I think conservatives like us are aware, that there is and we've been aware of this now for at least a decade, that there is a mainstream media, and then there is an alternative view. Yeah. And I'm profoundly convinced that that our governments, being ideological, rely principally on propaganda. It's their primary source of power. There's an absolutely organic link between propaganda and ideology. Ideology is nothing but it's itself nothing but an instrument of power. Ideology is a form of discourse that aims to attain and then maintain power. And propaganda is obviously intrinsically linked. It's absolutely organically linked to ideology.
Yeah.
And the Russian thing is simply a moniker or a totem or a taboo, depending on which side of the argument you are. So, but it's a totem or taboo depending on which side of the argument you are. Exactly as LGBT rights are. LGBT rights are also a totem in Western European societies. You have to dance around the totem. You have to venerate the totem.
Yeah.
But they're a taboo for Eastern European countries, and including Russia, but not just Russia.
Yeah.
And in the same way, Russia is also a totem or a taboo. So it excites in the minds of these propagandists all kinds of values or anti-values which they are doing everything to destroy in Europe itself. But I repeat, the primary goal of all this is European societies themselves, the primary target. Yeah. It's not, of course, Russia is a sort of collateral damage, if you like, and the whole of Europe is collateral damage. But the primary target of this narrative is to discredit conservatives, to discredit nationalists, to discredit patriots, to discredit anybody who is not, who doesn't agree with the overall woke ideological agenda.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing you say, because that the Russia debate is weaponized against the conservative movement, or let's even say broader, like the right-wing movement.
Yes.
Well, during the Cold War, it was the other way around, more or less.
Yes.
Because the conservative movement was against Russia in a certain way, or the Soviets, because let's not say that Russia is the Soviet necessarily.
No, indeed, but that's where we see the detachment of contemporary propaganda from reality, because the reality is that there is no conservative international directed from Moscow. It doesn't exist. Whereas there was a communist international directed from Moscow during the Cold War. And indeed, even before the Cold War, it started in, the original internationals were founded even before the Bolshevik Revolution. But once the Soviets had taken
in the
power,
19th century,
yes. So, but that did exist. That was a reality. Communism was an international movement, and you had cells of the communist movement all over Europe, and in many cases they were subversive cells and seditious cells and so on. And during the Cold War, they were very effective, but they were centrally organized, or at least partly centrally organized. I mean, no doubt there was a spontaneous element as well. None of that exists now. It's completely an invention of the fevered, conspiracy-minded imagination of wokery. The left, the woke, whatever the right word is for them, they are conspiratorially minded people. They believe that anyone who doesn't agree with them is either evil or stupid, and that whoever doesn't agree with them is part of some conspiracy, essentially. And you mentioned in your introduction that I've been attacked in the Dutch media. That's absolutely true. But what's so depressing and frankly stupid about these attacks is that there is absolutely no substance to them. They are simply the repetition of accusation is the goal. Yeah. The goal is not to get to the truth, to find out was there something in it, was there nothing in it. The goal is, on the contrary, to denigrate and discredit. In this case, me, but only because I'm associated with FVD. That's the only reason. I have no interest for them in any other capacity. Yeah. So it's a purely political thing, and it is profoundly dishonest, and it is the product, I repeat, of a fevered imagination. I was attacked again for the, I think, third or fourth time in the NRC Handelsblatt by a guy called Wilmer Heck, who just has a psychopathic inability to be honest. He is a dishonest individual, and he is a militant person who repeats accusations even though he knows that there's no basis to them or that they haven't been proved. He is only one example of, unfortunately, a large number of mainstream journalists who do that, because those people regard themselves as militants. They regard themselves as activists. They regard us, their political adversaries, as dangerous and despicable people. And so they think, Wilma Heck and the others, they think that they are doing a service to humanity by spreading lies about people like me. And it's a very, very unpleasant situation to be in. You know, the truth simply doesn't play any role in this. It's literally all propaganda. It's all on the level of emotion. What can I say? I mean, I just despair about it. And of course, what happens to me is of no consequence at all in the great scheme of things. But as we see, it also then nourishes a war footing in Europe and nourishes political decisions which are extremely dangerous, because the European elites and the previous American administration have put Europe into an excessively dangerous situation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and they used that state of like Russophobia to make it a weapon to attack people like you.
Yes,
but even us, because if you write critical about the Ukraine war, of course we can get or we expect a lot of.
But it's not just people like you and me. We all know perfectly well that Trump had it for years, for over 2 years. Then he had the 2019 impeachment, which was a sort of second version of Russiagate, and it continues. You know, it literally goes on and on and on and on in Europe now, a bit more than in America, because obviously Trump is in power now.
But Orban is, of course,
and
always
Orban
framed,
and Fico and Vucic and all the rest. And
even Marine Le Pen, like during her last election.
Well, it's true that in 2017 she did go to Moscow, and she was received by Putin, and that has. And then in 2014 they took a loan from a bank which was partly Russian, based in Prague. So they did have some links, if you like. But yes, they have been. She's now changed, by the way, completely, because it's been very costly to her politically. But there was an element of substance. Of course, it was greatly exaggerated, but there was a tiny particle of truth there, at least in the sense that she had been to Moscow.
Yeah, and now with the re-election of Trump and the reinstallation 2 months ago, or actually already 3 months ago with Trump, do you think that narrative will change a little bit? Because we talked about the narrative being one-sided, but with Trump and his force behind him, we see now a different perspective.
Well, obviously it's changing in the United States. I think everyone can see that. And the official line has changed 180 degrees. Or 360 degrees, as Annalena Baerbock would say. What I mean by that is that the Trump administration and the various envoys have talked about partnership with Russia. Witkoff, the day before yesterday, talked about economic deals with Russia. He didn't say what they were, but he emphasized those. And obviously, the language of partnership and mutually beneficial cooperation, including in economics, is radically different from what we've had for decades. Actually, certainly, I would say since 2014, and probably in a way since 2008. But the same is not true of Europe, where, on the contrary, the European Union is doubling down. And the anti-Russia or anti-conservative propaganda is intensifying. So we're getting to an absolutely bizarre level where, for example, a couple of days ago, the Latvian foreign minister said that attending the ceremony in Moscow to commemorate the 80th victory of the Allies over fascism or over Nazism, that's how the Russians refer to it. They always refer to the war as being against fascism. They never say the war was against Germany. She said, this foreign minister from Latvia, that to attend that ceremony would be contrary to European Union values. Well, you know, we hear every 5 seconds about Hitler and the Holocaust and the evils of 1930s Germany, and yet suddenly we are supposed to believe that attending such a ceremony is against European values. It's so incoherent and so it's so grotesque that, you know, one sort of shakes one's head really in disbelief.
Yeah, and I wonder, because you're already for a long time quite critical about the NATO.
Yes.
But now NATO and the world is finally facing our, well, how do we say it? Like opportunistic former Prime Minister, Mark Rutte.
Yes.
Who was saying for the last few years, saying Ukraine should be a member of NATO, of the EU. And now with Trump, he suddenly just changes.
Yeah. Well, it's... I mean, I don't feel sorry for him, but I almost feel sorry for him because he was desperate to get that job. He lobbied for it for a very long time, nearly a year, if I remember correctly. The lobbying required him to go and grovel to Erdogan in Turkey and go all over the place and make sure that he was accepted by everyone, which he eventually was. And yet, no sooner had he moved to Brussels than the NATO alliance fell apart because Trump and Pete Hegseth, within days of taking power, aimed a very large cruise missile at the transatlantic alliance, and said very clearly, as we know, that Ukraine would not join, and that any NATO member country troops, which in the scenario in which they would be sent to Ukraine, would not have Article 5 protection, and so on. Yeah. And as I expect you know, only a day or two ago, the Financial Times quoted somebody I think in Brussels saying the transatlantic relationship is over. So poor old Mark Rutte, who lobbied for this job, is now, of course, struggling desperately to maintain the existence of his job, because he, and we saw when he went to the Oval Office, the level of dishonesty really took one's breath away. He sat there, grinning in his unbearable way, as Trump said that he was going to take over Greenland and possibly even Canada. Greenland and Canada, obviously, both member NATO countries. So, and he simply said, "I'm not going to get involved in that debate." Well, I mean, that's just pathetic. I mean, how can you not get involved if one NATO country says it wants to take over the territory of another NATO country? I mean, good God. Yeah. Again, what level of detachment from reality can you have? And everyone sees through it. Everyone sees that he's totally spineless and opportunistic.
Yeah. So now finally the world sees what we had to deal with for 13 years. So,
yes, it's very striking. Yeah.
But on the other hand, the problem is now, and you already mentioned it, the EU intensifies the war mindset against the East. This weekend we had from our Liberal Party, D66, Democrats 66, they had to talk about, we have to create like a unified Europe, a United States of Europe. And that's the line. Yeah. So, it's famously said in Brussels, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so the crisis obviously is the American abandonment of NATO over Ukraine and of Europe more generally, because Trump, of course, has spoken, as we know, very aggressively against the European Union, saying it was set up to rip America off, and the European Union has been horrible in trade policy and so on. So the crisis is triggered by this unilateral abandonment by the Americans of the alliance with Europe, or at least with the European Union. And but they don't let a good crisis go to waste, and so they are doubling down, trying to use it, as we know, the Rearm Europe program, which was very quickly packaged, and now it's called not rearm anymore. It's called readiness or something else, whatever, to make it a bit more, cuddly. Anyway, that people friendly.
that program, of course, involves a very large amount of mutual debt, as in COVID. It involves pooling the defense spending and trying to coordinate it at European level. There's already now in the new von der Leyen Commission a defense commissioner, or even though the Commission theoretically doesn't have a role in defense. So, of course, the goal is to use the external enemy, to weaponize, as you said, the external enemy, in order to create Europe. But, this is simply history repeating itself. We've been here before. In 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the propaganda was in favor of Europe. And if in Hitler's armies there were Dutch volunteers, French volunteers, Scandinavians, Romanians, Hungarians, all the rest of it, they were, in their mind, fighting for Europe against the Bolshevik threat. And the European propaganda was extremely intense for those years. The same happened, by the way, in 1812 under Napoleon. Napoleon, when he launched the Russia campaign, said that he was launching it in order to unite Europe. He wanted Europe to have a single currency, a single legal system, a single capital, Paris as it happens. And so he too also wanted to use the war against Russia to create Europe. Yeah. And, Europe has always, the notion of Europe has always, certainly for the last 500 years, been, it's come about against an Eastern enemy. So it's the early appearances of the term Europe are in the 15th century when the Ottomans advance into the Balkans and of course then take Constantinople. That's the time when you see the first notions of a European alliance arising in sort of around 1450s or so. And now it's no longer the Ottoman Empire. Instead, it's the Russian Empire, which is for the last couple of centuries has played that role instead.
Yeah, and at a certain point during the Crimean Wars in 1850, we also had the problem in Europe that the Russians went way too fast to the Ottoman Empire, and they stopped
in the Crimean War. Yes,
in the Crimean War. Yeah.
Well, except that wasn't. That was I don't recall particularly strong European propaganda at that time, but there may have been. It may have been. Yeah.
No, but the whole point is like modern propaganda is of course different than the old days propaganda. But you saw again like the fear of like a new world power.
Yeah, I mean that was part. The Crimean War was I think it was a mistake, but it was part of the sort of jockeying for balance of power in Europe. The whole of the 19th century is characterized by the declining Ottoman Empire and what to do with it, and how much ground to give to Russia and so on. But I think in the other cases I mentioned of Napoleon and Hitler, that's when you have a really strong because you see, unlike in those other two examples, the Crimean War finished in 1856. But the Treaty of Paris, which ended that war, was signed by the Russian Emperor, and Russia was immediately once again part of the European concert, of the concert of Europe. It wasn't excluded.
No,
it wasn't driven out. And only, 10 or 15 years later, Russia was back in the game again, this time on the side of the Western allies, for example, in the Russian-Turkish War of 1877. So it's not quite the same. I think the Crimean War, however, whatever judgment one has on it, is more part of the usual, jockeying for power, balance of power, not too much Russian presence in the Balkans, not too close to the Straits and all the rest of it. It wasn't so much of an idea. It was a partly ideological war, but I think much less so than the other two examples.
Yeah, but the ideological war, or maybe even like spiritual war, has always happened, because if I just think about like the recent history, you always see at a certain point, I maybe even want to call it like a sadistic flirt with the Russian spirit, even during like the time of Catherine the Great. You see a lot of French philosophers going to Russia and just thinking that there might be the Enlightenment over there. Of course, it didn't happen, and it went to Europe. But we see it in different ages that at a certain point, Europeans like to like help the Russian people with a certain way. Let's go back.
Well, I think that's because it's the other Europe. I mean, it's I never cease repeating that it's the biggest country in Europe. The Russian, obviously, in terms of territory, it's the biggest country in the world. Never mind just Europe. But even I think the European part of Russia is the biggest country in Europe in terms of geography. Obviously, in terms of population, there are 140 or 150 million Russians against 80 million Germans. So there are nearly twice as many Russians as Germans. But Russia equally is a world unto itself. When you go to Russia, I've been there many times, it's such an immense country, and it's a civilization unto itself. It's not, it can't be subsumed into European civilization. It's simply too big for that. So it's the other Europe, and yes, as you say, the Voltaire and so on. They had their fantasies, and those fantasies were largely encouraged, of course, by the absolutist leaders in Russia. But now it's the other Europe in a different sense. It's obviously a red rag. It's the image of Europe. It's the image of everything which Western Europe and the European Union doesn't want to be.
Yeah.
So it's, but it always has that role as a sort of large space where you can project your fantasies.
Yeah, because we even saw it in the 90s, so like 30 years ago.
Yes.
When the fall of the Soviet,
yes.
a lot of Western leaders coming over there,
yes,
and
yes.
just almost like the little baby brother.
Absolutely.
Oh, we will teach you the way.
Yeah, exactly. yeah.
We will show it. And
yeah.
It's almost like, that's what I mean with like a sadistic flirt, because
Absolutely.
they flirt with it, but it's also more from like a power play.
Yeah. Well, this, of course, is, as you suggested in your question, is a very long-standing problem, and it goes back to the extremely well-known dilemma in the 19th century between Slavophiles and Westerners. The Russians themselves feel, or some of them anyway, have at different times in history felt this inferiority. Yeah. And it's a dilemma within Russia itself. On the other hand, I like to remind people that sense of inferiority or superiority, because the two sometimes go together, is actually felt by many other countries, by many countries. It's felt, it was certainly during the 19th century, after the French Revolution, very strongly felt in Germany, and we tend to forget that now, but the Germans regarded themselves as, some of them anyway, as backward with respect to France. France was modern, had a highly centralized modern state with a huge modern army and all the rest of it, very professional bureaucracy. Germany, meanwhile, was fragmented, as we all know, into hundreds of different statelets. So the Germans had this same, if you like, Slavophile or rather Germanophile and Westerner problem for most of the 19th century. And then other countries feel inferior. Even Britain, certainly in the post-war period, has felt inferior. It's obviously declined very spectacularly from a world superpower to a medium-sized European power, and that had generated a sense of inferiority. Yeah. So yes, the Russians had it, and yes, when those, as you say, philosophers or whatever, or the robber baron capitalists in the 90s, when they went there, they treated them with great condescension. But unfortunately, that did resonate with some aspects of Russian mentality.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and about that Russian mentality, you wrote in certain pieces or articles and interviews, you said about like the spirit of Russia, like it's called like the Ruski Mir. I think that's maybe also interesting to talk about, like the Russian viewpoint.
Well, Ruski Mir is I don't think I've ever used that expression in my own articles. I mean, Ruski Mir is an organization. It's obviously a concept, but it happens to be a sort of cultural organization. What do you want me to say about the Russian mentality?
Well,
I mean, it's I'm not I suppose I do know the country quite well now, but
but more in like we talked about the conflict, but most of the time when people talk about Russia, it's always like a Western mind about the problem and their politics, but never about where does Russia want to be in the whole picture.
Well, I think, as far as I understand it, Russia would like to be in a completely different situation from the one that she is in, namely in a situation where the whole of Europe is, or at least all of European governments are turned against her. Russia, as far as I know, never wanted that and would much prefer it to not be the case. As far as I know, Russia wants to maintain its great power status. Respect is very important. There's a certain amount of pride in all this. After all, as I say, it's a very big country. It's the biggest country in Europe, so it expects to be, they don't expect to be talked down to or treated with contempt. And of course, they regard themselves as part of European civilization in the broadest sense. They don't talk of themselves as being in Europe, but then again, nor did the British. The British, a little bit in recent years, perhaps, or recent decades. But typically, a British person would say, "I'm going to Europe" when he crossed the Channel. Yeah. So they would regard Europe as somewhere else, and the Russians is the same. So they also have that.
Yeah.
But, what they want and what they've got are two totally different things.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you what they want in Ukraine and what they want, what they will try to get now. But there's no evidence that they wanted the situation that they are now in.
No, of course not. But that's if we just read like the mainstream media, it's always like a one-sided view. It's always like our view, or let's say just like the left liberal view of the world.
Exactly. But the left liberal view, that is the whole drama of our times, that we are governed by, as we were saying a moment ago, we're governed by what in France they call the extreme centre.
Yeah.
So the extreme centre, which we know all too well because it governs every single European country with only a couple of exceptions, is an increasingly intolerant centre, which does everything it can to exclude and to suppress dissent that diverges from the centre, whether it's from the left or the right. You can see this very clearly in France at the moment, where, of course, for years the Rassemblement National has been the main bogeyman, but now that's shifting, and instead it's the extreme left, or the old left under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, La France Insoumise, France Unbowed. But that's the extreme centre is increasingly intolerant of any other point of view, and obviously, as I said a moment ago, Russia is the embodiment of everything that the extreme centre hates. Yeah.
It's interesting that you also mentioned for France that there is also a left-wing party that's getting like demonized, the same way as we see with the conservative movement.
Well, that is largely due to their policy on Israel. The left, La France Insoumise is very, very anti-Israeli, very pro-Palestinian. They have protested very loudly, in my view, quite rightly, about what's going on in Gaza. Yeah, and of course, the Israeli lobby, as we all know, is quite considerable, and so that's partly also. There's a big shift. The Israelis themselves have launched a number of overtures to right-wing nationalist politicians. It's been in the papers, by the way. The Israeli Foreign Ministry has been told to make contact with these parties. So, like Rassemblement National or the other nationalist parties in France, and in other parts of Europe, AfD, FPÖ, and all the rest of it. So inevitably they are being brought in. So Jordan Bardella, the president of the Rassemblement National, went to Israel recently with Marion Maréchal, Jean-Marie Le Pen's granddaughter. Yeah,
that's interesting, because we don't have that in the Netherlands, of course, because on our debate concerning like Israel Palestine is in that way more like free compared to other countries. But on the other hand, we are of course fully focused on like the one-sided picture of the Russophobia question.
Well, again, as I say, it's the extreme centre. The extreme centre is autistic. It cannot imagine. It is structurally incapable of imagining the other. Yeah. Those people, for them, the other is indeed this strange bogeyman, which they project, as I say, onto Russia, and which it consists of people who are either stupid or dangerous. So either people who aren't as intelligent as they think they are, or who are manipulated and are therefore evil in the service of some malignant project. And obviously that attitude is the very opposite of diplomacy. Diplomacy, by definition, as all kinds of politics, involves accommodating yourself in one way or another to somebody else's interests and somebody else's point of view. But in the European case, the extreme centre has stopped thinking in terms of interest a long time ago. This is, by the way, one of the major reasons why they can't get on with Moscow. It's because whereas in Russia there is a very strong discourse about interests and negotiation and making deals, it's not really like Trump, because of course Trump is all flashy and transactional and so on, but the Russians have had this mentality, and it certainly for the last I don't know, at least 10 years, if not much longer, and it no doubt corresponds to part of their national tradition. And yet Europe is on a completely different in a completely different mindset. It's in a mindset which where interests are not, you almost never hear of interests.
No.
In the European discourse. You hear of values, you hear of moral imperatives, you hear all the language of, puritanical condemnation, but you don't hear the language of interest or concrete sorting something out. Europe is never, never might be too strong, but I very seldom hear European leaders, particularly not in the European institutions, talking about, arriving at a settlement or sorting out a problem or, improving something. No, it's all in the realm of, high ideological ideas and moral condemnation. And, moral condemnation is not really much use in international politics, or for that matter, in domestic politics.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned diplomacy, because I read a few days ago that in the first month of the new Trump administration, there was more contact with the Kremlin in the first month than during the last 2 years of Biden.
Yeah, between the Americans, yes, of course. Yeah.
And we had, I think 6 months ago when Orban went on a tour to first Russia and then to China, and everyone was upset in Europe, and I was like, well, finally someone is going to talk.
Indeed. Well, again, you see, I mentioned earlier the whole the European values thing, but again, this propaganda is so shameless that when Orban went to Kiev, I think he went to Kiev first, actually,
first
if I'm not
Kiev,
mistaken,
and then Moscow,
and then, as you say, Peking and Washington. He went on what he called a peace mission. And that was attacked, and he was reprimanded by the High Representative, the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy. He was reprimanded, of course, by the other European governments, and they said, no, peace mission's totally wrong. You can't, we need to win this on the battlefield. And then as soon as Trump comes into office, these people have totally changed their discourse, and now are also using the vocabulary of peace. It doesn't mean, of course, peace. On the contrary, they want to carry on fighting the war, but they have changed their vocabulary. 6 months ago, as you say, they condemned the search for peace, and now they claim to be doing it themselves.
Yeah, but do you think that because of course it's misleading from the left liberal elite that they are now suddenly changing their way of speaking. But do you think the big mass falls for it, or
do people fall for it? Yes, I fear they probably do. Yes, I think that I'm afraid I've long believed that the system has a lot of life in it, and that we who are critical of the system are too often optimistic that somehow it will come crashing down, or that people will wake up, or whatever. I think there is a substantial decline in trust in rulers. And by the way, the extreme centre has established this and now regards it as a danger, which frankly it may well be. So yes, there's an increasing cynicism. And that's, I suppose one could welcome that. But on the other hand, I am myself now very cynical about that, because I think that one of the structural and I would say almost spiritual weaknesses of our states in Europe is that we typically hate our leaders.
Yeah.
And maybe they deserve it. Certainly some of them do. But I think it's very bad psychologically and emotionally for a people to hate their leader.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of our moral degeneracy, that we regard ourselves as advanced to the extent that we hate our leaders.
Yeah.
And we look down on countries like Russia or like Turkey or like the Middle Eastern countries where there is a cult of the leader.
Yeah.
Okay, that might take on a rather sort of apparently, caricatural dimension in some cases. But to me, it seems in an ideal world desirable that people would look up to and admire their leaders. Obviously, it's desirable that the leaders deserve that.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say it only is like necessarily like hate, but also like a feeling of shame. For that example, here in the Netherlands, we are ashamed of our country, our past, our history.
That's what I'm saying. It's part of it, because of course, if you look up to your leader, then that very often goes together with
patriotism,
proud of your pride in your country, and conversely, as you say, yes, if you hate or are ashamed of your leader, then you're ashamed of your country as well. But we've got so deeply into this rut now in Europe that we regard it almost as a badge of honor to denigrate our own leaders, and as you say, by extension, our own countries.
Yeah, and that of course goes to like we hate the West or the values of the West.
Yeah,
because you already said that certain people like also weaponize like the term like European values. Here in the Netherlands, we see a lot of like the terms like democracy and the state of law. They're always under attack. They're always being questioned, and that could be a problem. And especially in the Netherlands, like the state of law, it's for certain politicians, it's like the state of law is something that cannot change. It's an abstract thing.
Yeah.
Well, the state of law is it's a combining of different visions of what a state can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's also like it's really effective because we don't have a discussion about what can we be as a country or as a society.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel that's also like part of the whole problem that you just mentioned in the earlier things you said.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about the state of law, because that is that's a phenomenon, that's a consequence of the attempt to depoliticize politics. The European Union, of course, is an outgrowth of the same desire to make everything technical, make everything, as it were, above politics. And the state of law is an example of that. The idea that political decisions should be shunted off into the judiciary, and that people should, But again, we see very severe abuses of that principle in the cases in Romania, in France, where the democratic system is essentially taken over now by the judiciary.
Yeah. I talked a few weeks ago with a Romanian candidate who's also not able to participate, Diana Soșoasa.
Yes, very good.
And the funny thing is, she was allowed to participate in the European Parliament election, so now she's in the European Parliament.
Right.
But she's not allowed to participate in her own national presidential campaign. And I'm like, that's so crazy. But it's a fascinating but also a scary time in.
I don't claim to have any direct experience. I have a little bit of experience of dictatorship. So I visited, for example, Romania at the end of the Ceausescu period a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. I saw a number of other communist countries. I saw the Soviet Union right at the end in the last final years, and. But of course, I don't have any experience of the way those regimes were set up. But I often say we must never forget that they were set up in the name of progressive values. Yeah. Communism was a progressive doctrine back in. So if for Central Europe, 1945, or for Russia, 1917, and the people who were against communism were regarded, of course, as fifth columnists, as operating on behalf of a foreign power, and so there was a whole paranoia and brutality towards people who disagreed with this progressivist line. Yeah. And that's how dictatorship was set in place. It didn't. In Russia, it was violent immediately, and to some extent, I suppose, in the other countries. But if you look at, Poland or Czechoslovakia in the period 1945 to 1950, the dictatorship was set in place initially at the sort of very high level. So the banning of political parties, the control of the media, and so on. And then the police brutality and the concentration camps or whatever, that is, of course, secondary. Those are just the instruments. So it's, in other words, what I'm saying is that these things like closing down, banning candidates, cancelling elections, and so on, cancelling media, because in France they've just closed down a television channel. All these things are precisely what we mean by dictatorship. That it just objectively is what dictatorship means. It may then also translate into, the jackboot, but that is objectively what we're dealing with. Yeah.
We now see the same things happening by Brussels. Sadly. I want to end this conversation with what we started, or with what you said in the beginning, is that they are trying to use Russia as a weapon to attack the conservative or the nationalist movement. Do you have any tips on how to prepare for that? Because there are people listening, or even like young people who want to start an initiative, and they are afraid to get framed, stigmatized, whatever.
Well, I have to tell you that the thing is effective. I mean, I've tried to ignore it, but I'm sometimes conscious that I don't do things because I'm afraid of the consequences. Not that I'm particularly afraid of anything, but it is unfortunately very effective. I think that we just have to live in truth, and I think we have to be truthful to ourselves and to what we believe. And there isn't an easy answer to that question. It's a very good question, and it's a very important one. And I don't have an easy answer to it, except perhaps the one I've just given, which is live in truth, whatever that means. That's what the dissidents did. I mean, Václav Havel used to talk about living in truth. And that's how dissidents behaved in the communist regimes of Eastern Europe. They tried to carve out spaces of truth. They did it a lot, of course, in the cultural domain. Music, painting, literature to some extent. And I suppose we just have to all believe that truth will, finally be victorious. But I'm also conscious that, unfortunately, a huge amount of damage can be done until such time as the truth wins through. So, I mean, I'm afraid the specific Russia thing is carrying on. There's so much of it I've actually forgotten, but there have been more examples of it recently, which I've now haven't got immediately in mind. But it happens all the time, you know. So I'm afraid it's an inevitable thing. I suppose, obviously, what's happening now with Trump is a cause for hope. There's clearly a lot going on. Witkoff was in the Kremlin, or at least wherever he was in Russia, for 5 hours. That's a substantial meeting. I mean, Putin is known for being for devoting time and for taking a long time, and for often being late. Because he does, when a conversation gets going. He said this in one of the Oliver Stone interviews that Oliver Stone did a few years ago. He said that, I'm often late because someone comes in to see me, and I like to get to the bottom of the problem before winding up the meeting. So clearly that's what must have happened when Witkoff spent 5 hours there. And there clearly is a desire, and obviously Trump's his emotional instincts are to be as we know, pro-Putin, pro-G, pro-Erdogan. He likes strong leaders. He likes dealing with people like that, because he's one himself. So he appreciates that. And the fact that Trump is changing the tune and changing the mood music is obviously will have or may have anyway consequences in Europe. I mean, right now, as I say, Europe is doubling down, but on the other hand, there is also a limit to what the Europeans can do, because the whole thing has totally escaped their control now. They will, of course, try to double down in Europe. But there is some encouragement to be taken, I think, from the new music coming out of the White House. Yeah,
interesting. And do you also think that like the internet is more liberating now to connect
yes,
people,
I do.
Like-minded people?
Yes, I do. There was a time before Elon Musk took over Twitter that where things were getting very bad. It's something I follow quite closely. This whole issue of government penetration of social media and so on. And obviously there are people who still complain about it on X, and they claim they're being shadow banned or whatever. But yes, I do think, and I mean, again, we've seen this. I mean, everyone sees this. But Trump, for instance, in the campaign, went on Joe Rogan, and that is a sign that these media and these propaganda instruments that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation are losing their sway. They are losing their sway. The viewers on CNN are dropping faster than you can say CNN. Same thing in France with the established channels in favor of, let's say, more conservative channels. So there is a movement, and yes, I think the internet and social media are having a liberating effect, particularly since I don't know whether Trump has done this, but before he took office, he did promise to undo all the fact-checking and anti-disinformation funding. He promised to cancel it all, and he gave a very detailed video, which I'm sure was heavily influenced by a guy called Mike Bentz, who comments a lot on this, and he more or less hinted, Benz, that he had had a bit of input. And essentially, as I recall it, involved cutting federal funding to all these various institutes, many of them in universities, so they have a sort of allure of independence, but in fact they're simply working for the government. He said that he would cut all their funding, and it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. And again, that brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. When they had elections in France last year, I live in France, the Rassemblement National was in the lead, and indeed would have had a majority in parliament if they didn't have a two-round system. Jordan Bardella, who, I don't particularly admire, he's in some ways a rather inconsequential figure, but they did say that one of the policy undertakings they did was to privatize the main state television channels, and that would have been, it hasn't happened, so it's a parallel universe, but that would have been a very major development, just as if he has done it or is going to do it, the equivalent, the defunding of this whole disinformation industry would also be very, very significant.
That's an interesting point, Jim. And as my final question is, and that's for the viewers, where can they find more of you?
Well, the main place would be fvdinternational.com. And we obviously have a Twitter account, which is FVD_INTL. We have a weekly video broadcast called The Forum, which goes out every Wednesday at 4:00, and which I'm very happy with. We get very interesting guests to talk about a whole range of subjects. Of course, we end up talking a lot about politics, but also we talk about health, we talk about medicine, we try to keep a nice variety of subjects going. So those would be the two main places.
Oh, great to hear. And I want to thank you for your valuable time over here. And we had a good conversation, I guess. And then I will switch back to Dutch. Nou, bedankt kijkers. Ik vond het razend interessant om het verhaal van John Laughland te horen. Iemand waar het vaak in de Nederlandse media veel over gaat, maar eigenlijk nooit echt aan hem wordt gevraagd, hoe kijkt hij nou naar zaken? Ik heb het wel geprobeerd. Ik hoop dat jullie het gesprek het waard vonden. En als jullie het waard vonden, zou ik zeggen, abonneer op onze kanalen en geef ons een duimpje omhoog.